Quiet Strength, Chapter 7. God worked through Denny Green to shape me as a coach and prepare me for advancement. The Lord also brought Tom Lampier into my life in Minnesota. Tom was with Athletes in Action, a ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ. Athletes in Action focuses on the spiritual needs of athletes, encouraging and equipping them to use their platforms for Christ. Tom had been the Vikings chaplain since the early 1980s. Ever since I was traded in 1979, one of the first things I did whenever I moved to a new team was to connect with the team's chaplain. Many team chaplains are on staff with Athletes in Action, so a lot of them know each other and know when they are getting a Christian coach or player from another team. When I moved to Minnesota, I was looking forward to meeting Tom, and he had done his homework on me by contacting Mike Lusardi, the chaplain in Kansas City. By the time I joined the Vikings, Tom already knew of my faith. Tom claims that others had told him I had a great football mind. As a result, he was convinced that someday I would become a head coach and gain an even greater platform. Although he didn't share his thoughts with me right away, Tom made it his mission to help me grow in my faith and in my leadership abilities. He wanted to help equip me to use that greater platform when I got it. I liked Tom right away. I saw a sincere heart for people. Tom had learned that I like to fish, especially when there's no hook in my hand. We've made plans to get together for a day-long fishing trip in June, a few months after my arrival in Minnesota. June arrived, and the two of us headed out for a day of walleye fishing. Until I get to know someone, I'm somewhat quiet and reserved, but Tom was the exact opposite. He asked me point blank where I stood spiritually. Because Tom is often asked to refer players and coaches for speaking events, he wants the people he recommends to be solid people of faith. He then told me a little about the spiritual climate of the organization, and he described areas in which I might have an impact. When Tom dropped me off at my house, Lauren met us at the door. "Did Tony talk at all?" she asked. Tom assured her that I had. After that, Tom and I started meeting together regularly, and after about a year, he recommended we spend some regular time together studying the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is only 13 chapters long, and often doesn't get as much attention as some of the other books of the Bible, but Nehemiah contains significant lessons about godly leadership. Tom wanted me to not just read Nehemiah, but study it and begin to apply some of those leadership lessons in my daily life. Tom and I spent a year reading, studying, and discussing those 13 chapters, meeting every Thursday morning for breakfast at 6 a.m. at Jerry's Market. I often brought 2-year-old Eric with me. Eric loved pancakes, and he would eat while Tom and I discussed Nehemiah. During that year, Tom told me he believed the Lord had bigger things for me, and that when the time came, I would need to be a strong leader and a strong Christian. He reasoned, correctly, that when I did get a head coaching job, it would be because a change would be needed, and I would face many challenges. Through the course of our study, Tom pointed out that most of the failings of biblical leaders were spiritual rather than tactical. I needed to be prepared as much spiritually as I was in the X's and O's. I learned 3 key truths from Nehemiah. First, Nehemiah's opportunity came in God's time, not his own. Second, Nehemiah diligently prepared his mind and his heart so he would be ready when God's time arrived. Third, Nehemiah needed to be prepared to take on the problems, doubts, and adversity that would come his way both from the outside and from within. So it seems like here Tony has this really strong influence in his life by this man who was in charge of Athletes in Action, right? And he helps him a lot by encouraging him and really helping him focus on keeping his head clear and right and progressing in his life. They studied the Old Testament book of Nehemiah together, which contains a lot of lessons about leadership. And then Tony tells us that he learned 3 key truths from Nehemiah, right? The first is that opportunity came in God's time, not Nehemiah's time, not our time. Right. Secondly, that Nehemiah diligently prepared his mind and his heart so he would be ready when God's time arrived. And then third, that Nehemiah needed to be prepared to take on the problems, doubt, and adversity that would come his way both from the outside and from within, which are all 3 great life lessons to study and learn about. During my tenure in Minnesota, I increased my football knowledge, tactics, and strategies. In addition to all that Denny was exposing me to, Chris Forrester, our offensive line coach, and I often talked about big picture themes. Whenever Denny went through mock drafts with the coaches, Chris and I would spend hours afterward replaying the draft scenarios and talking about whom we would have chosen, when we would have tried to trade, and so forth. We also talked about training camp schedules, practice plans, and game management. More than anything else, we talked about how to win consistently in the NFL. I tried to force myself to think in terms of the big picture in preparation for the day when I would need to think about an entire football team, balancing short-term success and long-term stability. I had had 2 head coaching interviews before I even went to Minnesota, although neither job was right for me. The first interview was in Philadelphia in 1986, when Buddy Ryan got the job as the Eagles' head coach. The following year, 1987, I was interviewed in Green Bay for the Packers' head coaching position. That was an interesting interview. I sat across the table from Tom Bratz, vice president of football operations for the Packers, and we talked for about 2 hours. Finally, I asked him what the Packers were looking for in a head coach. Without batting an eye, Tom said, "Number 1, we want a guy with head coaching experience. And number 2, we want a real creative offensive guy." Since I was a defensive coach who had never been a head coach before, I obviously was not hired for the job. I wondered why I had even been invited for the interview. I had only 2 other interviews over the next 8 years, in Jacksonville when I finished second to Tom Coughlin, and again in Philadelphia when I finished second to Ray Rhodes. I really felt as if I had been close on both, which made not getting the jobs that much more disappointing. Lauren was especially disappointed. She believed deeply in my abilities, and she was still looking for a place where she could thaw out. In 1993, the Vikings had the number 1 defense in the NFL. Although there were 7 head coach openings that year, not only did I not get an interview, I never even got a phone call indicating I was on a team's list of candidates. That was a tough pill to swallow. I began to think that if God did have a head coaching job lined up for us, it might be a fairly long wait. Lauren was probably thinking the same thing, but Tom Lampier wasn't. He was always quick to remind me that God had already selected the team I would be coaching. I just needed to do my current job well, keep preparing, and wait on God's timing. I needed to trust his leadership rather than try to force an outcome I wanted. 2 years later, after the 1995 season, there were 2 openings. I still had interviewed only twice during those 8 years and 4 times overall. I didn't know anyone else at either team, the Miami Dolphins and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I told Lauren not to expect this to be the year that anything happened. It was well documented that Jimmy Johnson was the top choice of both clubs. Johnson had resigned from the Dallas Cowboys and would likely have his pick of the 2 teams. If Johnson went to Miami, Steve Spurrier from the University of Florida would be Tampa Bay's top choice. We figured the only way I might have any chance at all was if Jimmy took the Tampa Bay job, since then there would be no clear front-runner in Miami. But Jimmy signed with the Miami Dolphins, saying he had a better chance of getting back to the Super Bowl with Miami's future Hall of Fame quarterback, Dan Marino, than with Tampa's quarterback, Trent Dilfer. A friend of mine got word that the coaches at the University of Florida were packing to move 2 hours south to Tampa, so I never gave the Tampa job another moment's thought. It was time for me to start concentrating on next year's Vikings defense, doing my level best to trust God for the future. Jerry Angelo, who was the Buccaneers' director of player personnel and is now the general manager of the Chicago Bears, called me just before the East-West Shrine game, a college all-star game, to see if I would be there. Rich McKay, the Buccaneers' general manager, wanted to meet with me. I had planned to be at the game, so we arranged a meeting. I still wasn't getting my hopes up, though, so I warned Lauren that this interview was a real long shot. I knew how disappointed she had been when my previous interviews hadn't gone the way we wanted. As I arrived at the Santa Clara Marriott to meet with Rich, the little screw came out of one of the hinges on my glasses. I had never had a problem with my glasses before, so it had never occurred to me to have a backup pair. At this point, however, my glasses were in 2 pieces. I tried to hold the lenses in front of my eyes as I squatted down in the hotel driveway to look for the screw. I searched desperately all over the ground and finally found it, 3 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. I entered the hotel and said to the bell captain, "This is an emergency. I have a screw loose." I held up my glasses. "Do you have one of those really small screwdrivers?" He stared at me and then started to look around the stand for a screwdriver we both knew wasn't there. I was on the verge of being late and couldn't wait any longer. I was about to head to the meeting when the bell captain told me of a nearby optical center that could fix the glasses. A dilemma. Should I call Rich and tell him I would be late? Or should I be on time for the meeting but not be able to see him? If Rich were to ask me to diagram a play, or if he showed me something and asked me to respond, I'd have no shot. I finally figured that being on time was more important than being able to see, so I headed for the meeting, and all the while kicking myself for being too cheap, frugal, to own a second pair of glasses. I arrived at the meeting room right on time. I wondered if I should wear the glasses, even though they would only be hanging on one ear. I'd have to hold them up with my hand. Nice. But at least I'd be able to see. Or I could not wear the glasses and hope I wouldn't trip over a chair. Neither option was good, but at least I wasn't late. I decided to pocket the glasses. I took some comfort in knowing that this interview was only a formality, since Steve Spurrier will be taking the job anyway. Rich introduced himself, and I told him this would be one of his more interesting interviews. I can't see you at all right now because, although I ordinarily wear glasses, they broke just as I arrived at the hotel. I told Rich my story, and he commiserated with me since he also wore glasses. I finally decided to put them on, and then sat through the interview with my head tilted to one side to keep the glasses from falling off. About halfway through, Rich said he wasn't going to ask me to review anything, and I was welcome to take the glasses off. He was gracious throughout, but I felt like an idiot. Most of my prior interviews had gone well, but this one had not. When I reported back to Lauren, I told her I was pretty sure I had blown any slim chance I might have had at getting the job. It's just as well that Spurrier is taking this job because I have no shot, I said. Usually I tell you that I'm close, right? Well, I'm not close. We can forget this job. So here he's been working hard in the NFL, and he just hasn't been getting the interviews that he wanted. He hasn't been getting the opportunity to be a head coach potentially that he wanted, and he finally gets this interview, right, with Rich McKay, the Buccaneers general manager. And when he gets to the hotel where the interview is taking place, his glasses break, and, that's mortifying, right? Something bad happens right before you have a big interview or a big event. What do? Are you late to the interview or event? Do you go forward with it, not feeling fully yourself? And, he decides, okay, I'm just going to go into that interview, even though I can't really see much, and give it my all. And at the end, I think he's so flustered from what happened before, he's not feeling great about how the interview went. The interview with Rich was enjoyable, however, because we had talked very little about football. This surprised me because Rich was John McKay's son and had played football at Princeton. Instead, we spent almost the entire time talking about winning, developing chemistry, and a winning atmosphere, and relating positively to players. During the interview, Rich asked why I believed I had come in second or third in all those other head coaching searches. I informed him that it hadn't happened all that many times. I listed my actual interviews, a low number compared to the number of times the media had mentioned my name as a candidate. Rich was surprised. 3 days later, I had pretty much put Tampa out of my mind when Jerry Angelo called back to arrange a second meeting between Rich and me, this time at the Senior Bowl. I began to see a faint ray of hope. Then I heard that the Gainesville coaches had stopped packing because Spurrier was undecided. I bought a second pair of glasses. Before my second meeting with Rich, I read an article by Hubert Mitzel, longtime columnist of the St. Petersburg Times. According to his inside sources, I wasn't being considered seriously among the candidates for the Bucs job. I was only a minority interview, brought in to demonstrate the Bucs' commitment to diversity. I was crushed. Nobody had more inside sources in Tampa than Hubert Mitzel. I found myself questioning God's plan and timing. However, I still had a glimmer of hope. Not only had Rich and I developed a good rapport, but Jerry, whom I had known only casually before this process, was calling me every 2 or 3 days to tell me not to worry about what I might be hearing or reading. He said the Buccaneers were simply being very diligent and weren't conducting the search through the media. I met with Rich again at the Senior Bowl in Mobile, Alabama. We met for dinner at Russo's restaurant, and we still didn't talk many football specifics. Instead, Rich began asking me about the Buccaneers' current players. We didn't get into too much detail, but instead talked generally about how I thought certain players might fit into my plans for the club. I returned to Minnesota and Lauren. The next day at the office, I couldn't focus on the simplest tasks because of my excitement over the possibility in Tampa. Lauren seemed to be having the same problem at home. Yeah, because she wants to get out of those Minnesota cold winters, so she's really excited about the prospect of Florida. Jerry called 2 days later. Rich needs to know the name of your agent. May I ask why? He wants to begin discussing a contract. I hung up and contacted Ray Anderson, who represented Denny Green and Ty Willingham. I asked Ray to contact Rich. Then I went home to tell Lauren that things looked promising. You better not be kidding me, Tony. You better not be kidding me. Lauren had been on this roller coaster before, when I'd interviewed in Jacksonville, and their president had called me to say I was one of the last 2 candidates. She didn't want to get her hopes up unless it was a sure thing, especially on days like this one, when it was 20 degrees below zero outside. I swore Lauren to secrecy for a couple of days until Ray could work things out with Rich. The team flew us to Tampa so we could meet with the Glazers, the Bucs owners. They made arrangements for us to stay at the Tampa Airport Marriott, where Rich said he would meet us. As Lauren walked off the plane and into the warm jetway, I could tell from her gait and the angle of her shoulders that she already didn't want to return to Minnesota. Ever. Except to get Tiara, Jamie, and Eric, their 3 kids. Rich met us in the hotel lobby. As we stepped onto the elevator to head to the parking garage, some cameraman spotted us and the chase was on. Once we were buckled in, Rich sped off, winding through the parking garage and out into the airport, driving like he was in Starsky and Hutch. He used the back streets of Tampa, and by the time we arrived at Burns Steakhouse, Rich had left the press far behind. Or so we thought. Even on an ordinary night, Burns is an experience unlike any other. The restaurant has red velvet walls with gold trim, which add to the storybook feeling of the evening. We had a great meal and an enjoyable conversation with the Glazers. So again, he and Lauren here are meeting with Rich McKay, who is the Buccaneers general manager, and the Glazers, who are the owners of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they're all having dinner together. I wanted to be sure they knew how important my faith was to me. Given that they were Jewish, I wasn't sure how that would be received. As it turned out, the Glazers were wonderful people of faith. They seemed accepting, open, and welcoming of my approach to coaching faith and life. As we wrapped up our 3-hour dinner and headed upstairs to Burns' famous dessert room, someone suggested we turn on the television. The station we turned to was broadcasting live from outside of Burns. About 500 people appeared in the background of the camera shot from Burns' parking lot. Then I heard the reporter, "We believe that Rich McKay is inside with the new coach of the Buccaneers, and we're waiting for them to come out." It was a surreal experience to watch our situation unfold on television. A moment later, Mr. Glazer said, "Let's go out. Don't you think we should introduce them to the next coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers?" It was official. Lauren was finally done with Minnesota winters. We were headed to sunny Tampa, Florida. In the process, I had once again learned a valuable lesson. God's plans don't always follow human logic. I was finally a head coach, but it had happened in a setting and through a process that had made me believe I had no chance. We often can't see what God is doing in our lives, but God sees the whole picture and His plan for us clearly. So at the end of chapter 7, Tony finally gets his wish, and he is going to be the head coach of an NFL team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And his wife Lauren is also extremely happy because she is going to be leaving behind those cold Minnesota winters for sunny Florida.